Well, this is a great pleasure and honor for me. I've known Amitav Ghosh for years. We first met in New York when I was a graduate student there back in the late 80s, early 90s. And of course, I've been reading his works of fiction and his very, very important interventions in the non-fiction world on climate change. But I remember his essay on Pokhran, the nuclear tests back in '98. And this book, Smoke and Ashes, which is described on the cover as a writer's journey through opium's hidden histories, of course, builds on the research that he did and the stories that he told in the Ibis trilogy, which you all know, which looked at the rich terrain, impoverishing terrain of the opium trade, indenture, colonialism, labor. And in the course of writing and researching the book, obviously Amitav collected a lot of material and felt that somewhere down the line, there was a story that needed to be told, an urgent story, I would say, that needed to be told, written about, and that required him to break the confines of fiction. But what was very new for me as a reader was the central role of the opium, of drug trafficking in the US's own growth and development. And I wanted to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the extent to which, of course, the names Ascot, Cabot, Peabody, Brown, Hathaway, Forbes, these are all, storied, wealthy American names, the origin of whose wealth lies in the opium trade. But there's a lot more that the US got from China, apart from rich guys who made money from opium. And I wanted to ask you, Amitav, how, and perhaps it's the reason also why the American story is so important, because you draw parallels towards the end. But how much into your research did the penny drop that opium was central, not just to Britain, which we know, or we knew, or you knew before you even began your work, but to the US's own economic power and all the institutions that I will leave you to tell us some things about, where they picked up from the Chinese.
Certainly. Well, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here in this hotel, which I think is really the best hotel ever in my experience. And to be here with Siddharth, who I've known, as he says, for more than 30 years. Back then, I remember Siddharth used to play the sitar in restaurants to earn money. Mukho wouldn't believe me when I told him this. It's really, Siddharth, as you all know, has done an amazing job with The Wire. They've really kept, press freedoms alive in as much as it's possible. So it's great to be here talking to you. Now, Siddharth, you'll remember that back then you were at Columbia University, and we used to run into each other at the great library of Columbia University, which is known as the Low Library. And the Low Library is actually named after Abiel Abbott Low. And Abiel Abbott Low was one of the biggest opium traders in Canton. It's a very strange story, because Abiel Abbott Low went to Canton when he was in his early 20s. So what happened is that in early America, from the 1780s onwards, soon after America achieved its independence, They found themselves really cornered because they couldn't trade with the British colonies that surround America. They couldn't trade in the Caribbean with Canada. So, in effect, and the British were also blockading them from Europe. So, in effect, China became their lifeline. So they had to trade with China, and actually, within months of the British departure from New York, the first major expedition to China set off from New York. And, they went to China, they bought tea. As you know, tea played a major part in the American War of Independence because the East India Company monopolized tea and they charged huge surpluses on selling tea in the Americas. So you had the Boston Tea Party and so on. So they sent their own ships to try, to get tea from China and bring it to America. Tea at this point was really the largest. Taxes on tea was the single largest source of revenue for Britain. Taxes on tea brought in so much revenue that it could support everything in the British state, apart from the army and the navy. Every single institution of the British state could be financed by taxes on tea, and the taxes on tea were like 100%, whereas China itself charged an export tax of only 10%. So the British state was completely dependent on Chinese tea for its revenue. So the Americans decided to get in on this, and they went to China. They had a good response, and they started buying tea and bringing it back. The problem was this was the problem that the British had faced before, that they had to pay for tea with silver, with bullion. And in the 17th century, bullion was very easily available because the European powers were mining silver in the Americas with slave labor and enslaved Native American people. So they were extracting it at almost no cost to themselves and then using it in the China trade. But by the mid 18th century, there were massive global fluctuations, and they found it increasingly hard to lay their hands on silver. So, the Americans faced the same problem that the British had. The British had solved this problem by exporting large, enormous quantities of opium from India. We can get to that story later. The Americans didn't have that option. So they tried trading in ginseng, which is very easily available in America. They tried, rum, liquor, etc. Also leather. Then it became furs, but furs began. So John Jacob Astor, after the Astoria in New York, he got in big time on the China trade by sending furs there. Many of the other leading American families of that time got into the China trade. But again, they kept running out of every kind of good that they tried to sell there. They tried to sell, for example, sea cucumbers, sandalwood. They ransacked the Pacific Islands for sandalwood, sea cucumber, all kinds of other commodities. But the trouble with those commodities is that there's a limited market, So eventually, they resorted to the same expedient as the British. That is, they started sending opium. So the Americans pioneered the opium trade from Turkey, because Turkey also had a small, opium growing region near in Anatolia. So Izmir, a lot of American families settled in Izmir, and started sending opium from Turkey to China. They pioneered this route. And these were these families, the Astors, the Stephen Girard, who was a great merchant of Philadelphia. But the most important element, the most important conglomerate was based in Boston. And this was pioneered by a merchant called Thomas Handesit Perkins. And he became the center of this, what he called the Boston Concern. And there were a number of interlinked families, including the Lows. So, in fact, what arose there was literally a kind of caste system, This group of interlinked families, many of them based in Salem, Massachusetts. And in Salem, Massachusetts, now you have the largest museum of the China trade, which is this Peabody Essex Museum. Peabody's, again, became a major sort of trading family in opium. They started exporting. They would come to India, take Indian opium and take it to China. Even though initially they had a great deal of difficulty because they were shut out of the opium auctions of Calcutta. Because those were controlled by the British as well. So they became more focused on Bombay, where there was an independent opium trade. So the Lowe family was actually from Salem, Massachusetts, but they resettled in Brooklyn, and I feel this strange sort of connection with Abil Abbott Lowe, because the school my kids went to in Brooklyn were built were right next to a church that he built, and his house was at the end of the street, Pierpont Street in Brooklyn, overlooking the harbor. But, so Abil Abbott Lowe basically became, his son, one of his sons, Seth Lowe, became mayor of New York City. He became then the president of Columbia, and he built the Lowe Library. Another son of his became a big entrepreneur and inventor, and he basically bought up half the Adirondacks. He bought up enough land, as much land as the Duchy of Liechtenstein, and he personally sort of terraformed it by creating all these dams and things. So, there were all these, the sort of community known as the Boston Brahmins. Every single family of the Boston Brahmins made their money fundamentally in opium, But these were basically kids. Some of them were like 19 years old. There was a man called John Cushing, who went and made a fortune in China. And they managed to make these fortunes because Chinese merchants were incredibly generous to them. In particular, there was a man whose sort of English name was Hao Kwa, who was then the richest man in the world. And he helped, these families make these enormous amounts of money. Literally in like 2 or 3 years, they would amass like $500,000, which, is like almost $1 billion in today's money. Then they would go back to Massachusetts, these young men in their 20s and 30s, incredibly energetic, having arrived in China, having interacted with merchants from around the world. They were at the forefront of industry, they were very entrepreneurial. They understood, the Industrial Revolution that was happening. And when they got back to America, they invested their money, and often they were given money by Chinese merchants to invest in America. So one of the major sectors that they invested in was the railroads. So it was basically these China merchants, who created America's early railroads. And that's why you'll see, across America, the most frequently encountered name of towns is Canton. There are 30 towns across America called Canton, and almost all of these are located, on nodes in the railway. So, they were clearly signaling that, this is where the money was coming from. They knew that perfectly well. But every industry, basically these people built the American economy in its young years. They invested heavily in banking, in insurance, across the board, every single sector that you can think of. So all of it was founded on opium. And as also happened in India, these opium merchants were also great philanthropists. So they gave lots and lots of money to schools, universities, museums. That's why there's so many museums called Peabody. There are so many, Lawrenceville School in New Jersey was basically financed by opium money. But every major institution, Brown University was completely founded on opium and slave money. So, this is a very long chapter, and strange to think, nobody knows about it, strangely, even though it's hiding in plain sight. Many books have been written about this, but Columbia University has invited me to go and talk about the Lowe Library in September. Can you imagine? I, as an Indian guy, have to go and tell them about the history of the Lowe Library.
So give us a sense of how, at the level of policy making, but also some of these families in the US claiming to be very Christian, very virtuous, very moral. And it's not as if opium was not known to be dangerous. As you rightly point out, opium products with a very low opium content were, quite common across the world actually, as sort of medicinal or tonics, that sort of thing. But the smokable chandu format was not known and it wasn't used in the US or the UK. Yet the dangers of this were known. How did these people square the moral circle? That on the one hand, you're talking how enlightened you are, civilized, Christian, moral values, and then you're basically selling a substance that you know to be dangerous and that you wouldn't allow to be sold in your own societies.
I know, that's the bizarre thing. And, because all these young American merchants and young British merchants equally, most of them were Scottish, from the Scottish Enlightenment, very sort of committed Protestants and so on. On the one hand, they talk this incredible sort of, how shall I say, all these pieties, about improving the world and rescuing the heathen and this and that. And on the other hand, they're selling opium quite openly. So often...
And going to war to
eventually,
over your right to sell opium.
That's right. That's what Britain did. It declared war on China in order to literally force China to keep importing opium. Just imagine if today Mexico were to say to America, we're going to make war on you so that you have to keep importing cocaine or whatever. It's exactly it was exactly that situation. So, it's a really remarkable thing. You have these ships, you have these ships' diaries written by these young merchants who, on the one hand, will record all how often they prayed, and then also record how much opium they sold. So from one side they were selling of this ship, they were selling opium. From the other, they were handing out Bibles. It's a bizarre thing. Just a complete sort of rupture in consciousness, if you like. But if you come back to it, at the end of the day, when all these merchants went back, these young merchants went back to America, they established essentially a kind of omerta. They never talked about their opium peddling activities because there was an even greater stigma at that time on drug peddling than there is today. They never mentioned it. They would write to their families and say, never talk about this. They would describe how they were selling opium, to their wives and say, but never can you talk about this. And in fact, for generations, that silence continued.
So unlike the other great Western evil, which is slavery,
yeah,
which had many public defenders based on all kinds of cock and bull, theories of race and hierarchy, etc., this was something considered even more shameful, and hence not something that anybody wanted to publicly justify?
None of them would ever publicly justify it, but in as much as they did, they had various things that they borrowed from the British. But, at the end of the day, if you try and ask yourself, how is it that they reconcile this with their conscience? Because they talk about conscience all the time, these, these young sort of Protestant merchants. What they were doing, they justified to themselves because, you have to remember that they're from a country where slavery is legal. They're from a country where they're essentially killing, massacring hundreds of thousands of native indigenous Americans. So in that context, perhaps it was not considered such a great thing that you go and poison people elsewhere. So at the end of the day, again, it's a matter of race. For them, to peddle opium to white Americans would have been considered utterly shameful. But to do that in China is considered normal because, in fact, they blame the victim. They say it's because the Chinese or because Asiatics are physically feeble, because they're degenerate, because they're physically degenerate, because they're racially impoverished. That they become dependent on opium, completely obscuring their own role in creating these dependencies, And that's the kind of terrible tragedy of it, because actually, anyway, we can come back to that later.
Yeah, let's look at the India connection now. India is central to the opium trade as far as the British are concerned, because this is where the stuff is grown. And you document how India goes from exporting a couple of hundred chests of opium in a year to exporting more than 1 lakh or 2 lakhs, all under British, tightly controlled. I mean, they even had an opium department in the government to supervise the growing and the collection and the Hazari. Which factory is it? That's the Ghazipur factory. Opium factory is, as he points out, one of the oldest continuously running.
The oldest.
The oldest continuously running industrial enterprise, as it were, or facility. And, you know, on the one hand, you had Britain making huge amounts of money, devastating generations of Chinese with this product, bringing the Chinese, the Qing government, defeating them militarily twice to force them to buy this stuff. But they also had Indian and many, of course, the Indian opium grower, poppy grower, didn't see any great improvement in his or her lot.
No.
But there were Indian accomplices in the opium trade, and they were in Bombay, to some extent in Calcutta, other sorts of middlemen. Tell us a little bit about the role that they played. How central were they to this British enterprise, and what kind of changes did this bring about in Indian society, Indian urban culture? Because you believe that there is a great unacknowledged debt as far as hybridity, style, culture, the ability of the urban Indian to adapt, which probably can be traced back to what Indians picked up from living in Canton. So tell us the story of these Indians who were central to the opium enterprise.
Sure. So what happened is that, historically, opium has always been a very important medicinal commodity, going back to antiquity. Humans and poppies have co-evolved. In fact, the opium poppy doesn't grow naturally. It's a cultivar cultivated by humans. So as a medicinal substance, opium is absolutely miraculous. I mean, morphine to this day at end of life treatments and so on, it's the only thing that works. So opium is something that we have always been dependent on in some way or the other, and probably always will be. And that's why there is this strange ambiguity around opium, which always makes it difficult, to completely exclude. So, for instance, today, there's a little bit of opium in a number of medicines that you can buy freely in the market, like Imodium. Lots of cough medicines have codeine in them, and these all come from opium. Those are perfectly legal. At the same time, other grades of opium are not legal, like morphine, heroin, etc. So what happened was that going back to Mughal times, a small amount of opium was grown in the Patna region and also in the region around what is now Neemuch. Basically it's called Malwa. But these were really very small quantities. But once the Dutch arrived, the Dutch were the pioneers in this. They began to use opium to trade with in the East Indies. In the Dutch East Indies, they used opium to create monopolies, across the Dutch East Indies. And they grew the amount of opium consumed in the Dutch East Indies almost 20-fold within like 50 or 60 years. So, Holland grew incredibly rich of the opium trade. I mean, there were governors general of Java who went back with the equivalent of Bill Gates's fortune, in guilders in the 17th century. So the Dutch, the Dutch story of the whole Dutch, the Dutch efflorescence of art and so on, is founded on the one hand on opium, on the other hand on the massacre of the Bandanese and other spice-producing people. It's an incredibly grim story. So the British, once they took over this region after the Battle of Buxar, they then imposed a monopoly on opium, and they started very rapidly expanding the opium, the opium-growing regions of what we would now call Purvanchal. Basically going eastwards from Patna to almost to Allahabad. So all this opium was basically a large part of it was sold to in Southeast Asia, and the rest, the great bulk of it, was sold in China. And so this was the opium from Eastern India. But the British were able to establish this monopoly of on opium because they had complete military control of this region, of Eastern India. However, they did not have military control of Western India. Even as late as 1800, Bombay, which they had had for more than 100 years by that time, was just a tiny outpost. And in fact, it was an outpost that had to be heavily subsidized by Madras and Calcutta because they had no revenues or anything. And the reason for this is that the Maratha states were actually militarily very powerful. They fought the British to a standstill repeatedly. They defeated the British repeatedly. And it wasn't until the Battle of Hassaye in 1803 that the British gained complete ascendancy over the Maratha states. But even then, the ascendancy was not complete. I mean, for example, the Sindhyas continued to maintain a large army. So the British were not, they tried very hard to establish a monopoly on opium in the Western states, but they couldn't. Because by that point, the rulers of these Western principalities, like Baroda, Gwalior, etc., they were very big time in collusion with the networks, with the mercantile networks of Western India. And they protected these mercantile networks in Western India, and they nurtured them and so on. So the opium, the opium cultivation in Western India grew phenomenally. It almost began to outstrip the cultivation of opium in Eastern India. And again, all of that was sent to China. So it's very interesting. Almost every commercial community in Western and Central India was deeply involved in the opium trade. If not in the export, then certainly in the growing of opium. So what can you say? I mean, absolutely every Indian commercial community, in Western India was completely involved. I mean, whether it be Maimans or Muslims or Hindus or Parsis or Christians for that matter, because one of the great opium traders was Roger de Faria of Goa. So all these communities were completely sort of involved in the opium trade, and they founded, their fortunes were founded on it. In effect, if you look at any major trading house, of Western or Central India, you can almost always trace their capital accumulation back to the opium trade. This is a history which is very carefully sort of elided, but even in Eastern India, it was very interesting that in Eastern India, because the British had a complete monopoly of the opium trade, the merchants of Eastern India were absolutely shut out of the opium trade. It was completely dominated especially by a Scottish cartel. But the only community that could actually compete with them were the Marwaris. Because actually Marwaris, the whole Marwari migration into Calcutta on a large scale began with opium, Opium was a commodity that they had become very skilled at handling in the Marwar region, in Kota, etc. The Rothschild of opium was a man called Seth Bahadur Mal. And he was based in Kota. But from Kota, he would actually manipulate the opium auctions in Calcutta. They had these incredible, really proto-Bloombergian systems of information whereby they could speculate in opium in Calcutta, from Kota. In effect, because the Marwari merchants had access to Malwa opium, they were able to hold their own more or less against the Scots. But Bihari and Bengali merchants were absolutely shut out. They weren't even, the East India Company would allow British merchants to buy opium, and then they would provide them with insurance, etc. For Bengali merchants, they would not provide insurance, and they would insist on immediate payment, which they would not for let's face it, white merchants. They would not. They were not expected to pay insurance. So, through these commercial practices, they basically destroyed the commercial classes of Eastern India. And I think, we see the lingering effects of that to this day. I mean, in Eastern India, really, the economy became a state-controlled economy. It became an economy that was completely dominated by colonizers. Whereas in Western India, in Bombay especially, it was much more egalitarian. The Western merchants were really competing with Indian merchants on much more equal terms. And they were actually heavily dependent on Indian merchants because Indian merchants had access to the internal networks that were distributing opium basically from Ahmedabad onwards. So many of the most, one of the, there was a merchant called Kesharmal Hathi Singh based in Ahmedabad, who was one of the biggest, opium retailers. So, in this way, Bombay developed in a completely different direction.
So tempting though it is to link to when you compare Bombay and Calcutta, or Bengal and Maharashtra, Western India, you're saying that rather than, the reason why the two cities are quite different and the two states have a very different economic and business culture is not just because of the license permit Raj and popular protest and left movements of the current era, but actually has a much longer history, which has to do with the way in which elites in both regions were able to do business.
Absolutely. It's absolutely the case. I mean, the indigenous merchant class of Eastern India was completely destroyed. It was shut out. But more than that, what happened, I think, is that it created a deep belief in the fraudulence of markets, And I think you can trace back the tradition of Bengali radicalism essentially to this, that the market was always completely manipulated in Eastern India. Whereas in Western India, you actually had this process of more or less free competition. And I think this has left very, very lasting traces. And it's not just me. I mean, many economic historians have pointed to this.
This reminds me of the section in your book where you actually talk about the role played by free market theories, Adam Smith, Ricardo, as in some senses providing moral cover to the drug trade of the 19th century. Tell us a little bit more about the anything goes kind of philosophy.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Actually, it's in the late 18th century that these ideas begin to come out of Edinburgh, basically, with the Scottish Enlightenment and so on, with Adam Smith and so on. The thing is that it's in this period that European culture becomes very skilled at creating these abstractions, these abstract systems of thought, these abstract laws, which they imagine to be. So one of these is the idea of abstract natural laws, So, for example, when they are wiping out Native Americans, the British would always say that, it's not our fault, it's nature. Nature is doing it because nature is spreading the pathogens. Nature is spreading the diseases. When in fact, they were themselves, distributing blankets full of disease and, promoting, the pathogens in one way or the other. And of course, the native people understood this perfectly well. I mean, they said that these diseases are bullets that they're aiming at us, So it's a very curious thing that you see this emergence of this nature-culture divide within Western thinking in that period. And the same sort of thing happens in relation to economy. So, you get this idea that there's a natural balance between the laws of supply and the laws of demand. You have this law of the marketplace which balances supply versus against demand. And it's so ironic.
So don't interfere with free trade.
So you can't interfere with free trade. Free trade has to follow its, it was a free market fundamentalism, basically. It was in the name of free market fundamentalism that they let millions of Indians die of famine. Because, they wouldn't allow Indians to, they wouldn't allow any kind of intervention, state intervention, to provide relief. It's so strange. I mean, the Nizam of Hyderabad was intervening. to provide relief for people dying of famine in Hyderabad. But the British, Linlithgow was the worst. I mean, the crazy man, just wouldn't let any kind of relief be provided. Whereas the Mughals, they rode out the little ice age of the 17th century, where the whole world was devastated by famine. But they created these whole systems of granaries, which actually got India through those terrible times with, I won't say very little cost, but with less cost than would have been the case if they had followed these kinds of doctrines. So in the same way, one of the major justifications of opium of the opium trade was that the demand exists. And if we don't meet it, someone else will. But this is the real issue, this is the crux of the matter, that they are dealing with a substance that creates its own market, that doesn't follow the logic of supply and demand. If you make these addictive substances available, but most of all, if you make opioids easily available, they will create their own demand as of itself. So, for example, in America, the Sackler group of companies, which started marketing OxyContin in about, I think it was 1992, 1993. Before that, there was no demand. But once they stepped in and started advertising and they started making these opioids widely available, the demand rose astronomically. I mean, over a 10-year period, it rose like, I think it's a 10,000-fold. It's the same thing that the East India Company did. They provided this, they made this drug easily available, and the demand rose as if of itself. So, this is the weird thing, that these abstract laws of the market were essentially this whole discipline of economics, which to my mind is absolutely without foundation, simply because it's founded upon all kinds of mistaken assumptions such as rationality and so on. But most of all, this idea of the balance of supply and demand, how strange it is that it comes about, this whole ideation about this balance of supply and demand comes about in relation to a commodity that does not obey the laws of the marketplace, that creates its own law.
I mean, one of the strongest, the book is replete with contemporary significance, even though you're telling a historical tale. But the point really gets driven home when you discuss the relevance of the story to the opioid crisis in the US. And in particular, in fact, just as the opium trade of the 19th century was facilitated by collusion between economically powerful individual players or firms and backers in the state apparatus in the US or the UK. You see a similar process at play here, right? Where regulators, politicians, lobbies all play their role in foisting the opioid crisis on the US. I think you mentioned a figure of 400,000 deaths?
Yes, more than in the Second World War.
The number of people killed by this problem.
Yeah. So, basically what happens is that when you invent this theory of the balance of supply and demand, what you're doing is that you're removing all ethical constraints that had traditionally been in place to limit the profit motive, Before that, certainly this is what the Chinese repeatedly said to the British and the Americans, that don't you recognize that there are ethical limits to what you can trade? That you can't do this because it will destroy society. And of course, the British and American response was no. Adam Smith says that the laws of the marketplace this is higher, that the laws of the marketplace supersede the laws of ethics. So the weird thing is that when it actually comes home to roost, of course, Americans have regulated tobacco, they've regulated opium. They started doing this in the late 19th century. So there's a peculiar kind of doublethink in all of this that accompanies this whole idea. And if you look at China today, the way that they run their industrial sectors is precisely by creating very strong governmental restraints. And this was how the Chinese economy functioned, historically as well. That there are certain things you cannot do because they're bad for society. But today in the Western world, bad for society doesn't exist because society doesn't exist, according to Margaret Thatcher. So there you are. I mean, these whole this kind of ideation, this incredibly destructive kind of ideation, really comes out of the early 19th century.
The story you tell also links up with the Great Derangement, your work on climate change, because we're talking about essentially the same destructive forces at play, allowed to operate unchecked.
It's exactly that, and that's really the parallel, because it's a strange thing. Traditionally, all societies have recognized that if you give free rein to the profit motive, ultimately it will destroy society. This is present in let's say the story of the Manusha Mongol, the Manusha Devi, the very powerful story in Bengal. I mean, it's basically a story about the environment and the merchant, and how the environment insists on trying to create a balance. How Manusha Devi tries to create a balance between the needs of other beings and the profit motive. In China, historically, merchants were the third rung of society, very carefully regulated and surveilled because the profit motive was recognized as being very dangerous. And they recognized that if allowed to reign supreme, the profit motive would, in fact, destroy the world. And that's what we are seeing today. Just absolutely plainly in front of us. These energy companies, in order to nurture their profits, are essentially destroying the world.
My last question to you is, in chapter 17, when you talk about how you nearly abandoned this project and then decided to finish it, and you say, looking back now, I realize that it was not only because of the despicable meanness of the story that I gave up on the project. There is also an inherent conceptual difficulty in telling a story of this kind. The problem lies in the inescapable presence of a non-human protagonist, a plant. The way I read the book, though, the principal protagonists are humans, and pretty evil, bad humans. So why are you granting agency, or I mean, is it the plant or is it the human that's the problem here?
I think it's not just me. Many people who've looked at the history of opium, you begin to recognize, at a certain point, that you're dealing with an entity which has some kind of intelligence. I don't know if you can actually use that word, because we recognize intelligence in humans, but we don't recognize intelligence in plants. But this thing is a purposive entity. It's creating its own histories. So agency is a term that we use in relation to history, and there can be no doubt that the opium poppy has a kind of agency. And the clearest way you can see this is because what it does is not random. It creates these symmetries over time. So, in fact, in so many ways, China's 19th century opium crisis exactly mirrors the American opium crisis of today. The similarities are so striking that it's kind of actually uncanny. I've pointed them out in the book. They operate in almost exactly the same ways. In China in the 19th century, opium reached one critical moment was when opium was discovered, within the palace in Beijing. Well, it's in the palace it's in the White House. It's in all the major seats of power across the West now, and you see it occurring in exactly this way. Dissolving structures of state, because no country has been able, apart from China, in the mid 20th century, what China achieved, but also India, we achieved it for a brief period. We managed to bring opium consumption under control in India, in Indonesia also. That was a part of a very fierce nationalist backlash against opium. But what opium really does is that it undermines structures of state. So that's what it's doing in America today, creating these huge patterns of corruption, where the FDA, very trusted institutions like doctors and so on, the whole medical system becomes complicit in pushing opium, where it reaches, into the police. There are so many stories of how the police have been profoundly corrupted by opium in America.
But it's still the business interest that's, or the profit motive that's driving this rather than the plant, right?
How do we know? The plant creates the circumstances in which the profit motive.
Because it's something that you can't. As you said, it's a dual use. Societies need to have some legitimate legal form of opium for a variety of reasonable, proper uses.
Absolutely.
And yet it's a product that has this nasty other set of uses.
That's the thing. Opium is an incredibly powerful agent. And I would say that it's a powerful agent in history because, there are other botanical entities that have played a very important role in history. Sugarcane,
Tobacco,
sugarcane. But sugarcane and cotton perhaps even more so because they created these plantation models and so on. But if you look over time, sugarcane and cotton have sort of faded in importance. They faded in importance economically around the world, whereas opium has grown stronger and stronger and stronger. It's eluded every attempt by every government to establish control of it. And it's continually eating away at state structures. Northern Mexico is now, the state has virtually evaporated. Apparently a very large part of the arms that the West is sending to Ukraine is ending up in northern Mexico. Not just northern Mexico, but also amongst the underworld in America. And as we've seen, opium is now playing a very major part in the problems in the Northeast. So I'm sorry to say this, but I think what the world is facing today is multiple intersecting crises, of which the climate change is the most visible. But there are many others like biodiversity loss and so on. But the opioid crisis is just as important in its own way.
On that note, we'll have to stop here. Amitav Ghosh is one of those rare writers of fiction, rare novelists whose interventions in the world of scholarship are, the stuff of legend. I think that his novels on, the Ibis trilogy, are works that have been acknowledged by scholars of, say, the opium trade as having played a seminal role in triggering their interest, providing material and fodder for them to want to work on. And I think that what you've done with this book, the number of strands that you've drawn together, and the number of the way you've told multiple stories through this singular thread of opium is, I think, one of those that's going to have great value, not just for lay readers like ourselves here, but I think future scholars will also look at this as triggering a number of interesting research ideas and fields of inquiry. So I want to congratulate you for this book. I think it's a great contribution, and I'm very, very happy that Harper Collins asked me to be here to have this conversation with Amitav, because it's been a great learning experience for me too. And I would urge all of you to get the book, read it, share it with your friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth, for your very generous comments, and thank you for being here.